Nality stopped halfway through the bank lobby when her mother slid a folder across the waiting table. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she said quietly. "Your brother's wedding is only 3 weeks away." Nality opened the folder. Every savings account she thought still existed had been emptied. The family home had already been sold. Her father folded his arms and said the words she would never forget. "One day you'll thank us for putting family first." Before Nality could respond, a bank employee hurried toward her. He looked at the documents, frowned, and asked one unexpected question. "Ms. Nality, who authorized these transactions?" "My name is Nality. I was 31 years old, and for almost 10 years I had worked as a biomedical engineer. My job was difficult, but I loved it because every project brought me closer to my biggest dream. I wanted to save enough money to buy my own home and one day open a small medical technology consultancy. I was careful with every paycheck. I avoided wasting money, worked extra overseas assignments, and believed every sacrifice would give me a better future. Because I often traveled for work, I trusted my parents to help with some family paperwork whenever I was out of the country. I never imagined that trust would become the biggest mistake of my life. When I returned home, I expected to spend the next few weeks helping my younger brother, Kofi, prepare for his wedding. Instead, my mother quietly pushed a folder toward me while my father watched without saying a word. As I opened it, my hands began to shake. Every savings account I had spent years building had been emptied. Before I could even understand what I was reading, I learned something even worse. The family home had already been sold. My parents calmly told me everything had been done for the good of the family and that one day I would understand. I could not believe they had made such huge decisions without asking me even once. Then, a bank employee looked at the papers, frowned, and asked one simple question that changed everything. "Ms. Nality, who authorized these transactions?" In that moment, I realized the truth might be very different from the story my parents were telling. I wanted to shout. I wanted to demand answers from everyone standing in front of me. But I knew anger would not tell me the truth. So instead of accusing anyone, I asked one simple question. "Who approved all of these transactions?" The room became strangely quiet. My mother looked at my father before answering. She said he had handled everything because the wedding expenses became much bigger than anyone expected. My father quickly shook his head. He said they had only done what was necessary for the family and that my mother had been involved in every decision. Before I could ask another question, Kofi stepped forward. He looked confused and told me he knew almost nothing about the money. He said he believed our parents were paying for the wedding from their own savings. His answer surprised me because it was completely different from what they had just said. The more questions I asked, the more confused everyone became. Every person gave a different story. Even the dates did not match. My mother mentioned 1 month, while my father mentioned another. Kofi said he had not even been home on the days they were talking about. I listened carefully without interrupting because I realized something important. People who are telling the truth usually remember the same events. But every answer I heard created another question instead of solving one. The bank employee quietly asked me to step aside for a moment. In a calm voice, he advised me not to believe anyone until I requested the complete transaction records from the bank. He explained that the documents would show exactly when each transfer happened and who had authorized it. His words gave me hope that facts could tell the story better than emotions. As I walked through the parking lot, still trying to understand everything, a man I had never seen before called my name. He hurried toward me, handed me a sealed envelope, and said it had been waiting for months until I finally returned home. Then he walked away before I could ask him a single question. I stood beside my car and looked at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. My name was written on the front, but the paper looked old and worn. Several forwarding labels had been placed on top of each other, showing that the letter had been sent to different addresses before finally reaching me. Someone had been trying very hard to contact me, but I had never received a single message. I carefully opened the envelope, expecting it to be another bank document. Instead, I found a letter from a property consultant whose name I had never heard before. The first sentence immediately caught my attention. He explained that he had tried many times to reach me before the family home was sold. He had sent emails, letters, and meeting requests because my name appeared in documents connected to the property. Since I never replied, he believed I had chosen not to be involved. Reading those words made my heart race because I had never received any of his messages. Inside the envelope were copies of his records. They showed several meetings that had been scheduled with me over the past few months. Every one of those meetings had been canceled before they happened. Next to each cancellation was a note saying that I had personally decided not to attend. That was impossible. During those same weeks, I had been working overseas on a medical project thousands of miles away. I still had my travel records, work schedules, and flight tickets to prove exactly where I had been. Then I found a timeline attached to the letter. It listed important dates, phone calls, canceled appointments, and decisions about the house. According to those papers, someone had been speaking and making choices, as if they were acting for me while I was out of the country. I could not understand how that had happened or who had been doing it. At the end of the letter, the consultant wrote one final note. He believed there was still one unresolved issue connected to the sale of the house. Until that question was answered, he did not consider the entire transaction completely finished. For the first time, I realized the story was much bigger than my missing savings. The letter gave me one new direction, so I decided to follow every small clue instead of making guesses. The property consultant mentioned that many years ago my grandfather had worked closely with a land surveyor who knew the history of our family home better than almost anyone. After asking around, I finally found the elderly man living a quiet life in a small house on the edge of town. He had retired long ago, but when I introduced myself and told him my grandfather's name, a warm smile appeared on his face. He invited me inside and said he had not heard that name in many years. We talked for a long time about my grandfather. The old surveyor described him as a careful man who never liked confusion when it came to family property. Then he shared something that immediately caught my attention. He said my grandfather always repeated the same sentence whenever important papers were being prepared. "Never trust only spoken promises," he would say. "Memories change when pressure arrives." My grandfather believed that every important family decision should be written down clearly because people often remembered events differently when money or emotions became involved. The surveyor explained that he had helped prepare maps and property records many years before. Although he no longer kept those documents, he believed copies of several instructions had been placed in the municipal archives. Those records might still exist if they had not been destroyed over time. He even remembered seeing handwritten notes attached to some of the files, but he could not remember every detail after so many years. Before I left, he became unusually serious. He looked directly at me and told me not to spend all my energy chasing the missing money. He said money often becomes the center of attention because it is easy to see, but the real truth is sometimes hidden somewhere else. "Ask yourself why everyone keeps talking about the bank accounts," he quietly said. "Sometimes the real story is hidden behind what everyone is arguing about." His words stayed with me the entire drive home. Until then, I believed I was trying to recover my savings. Now I began to wonder if the missing money was only one small part of a much larger story that nobody wanted me to discover. A few days later, it was time for Kofi's wedding rehearsal dinner. The hall was beautifully decorated, and everyone seemed excited for the wedding. Family members laughed together, shared old memories, and congratulated my parents for everything they had done. Again and again, I heard relatives praising them for making great sacrifices so Kofi and his future wife could begin their marriage without financial problems. They called my parents generous and loving. I stood quietly, listening to every word. Nobody knew what I had recently discovered, and I was not ready to interrupt the celebration with questions that still did not have complete answers. As I looked around the room, I noticed something strange. People smiled at me politely, but several relatives seemed surprised that I had actually come. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then, while everyone was finding their seats, one of my elderly aunts walked over to the table where the seating chart had been placed. She studied the list for a few moments before looking at me with a confused expression. "My dear," she asked kindly, "why isn't your name on the guest list? You're standing right here." The room became completely silent. Several people immediately turned toward my parents, waiting for someone to answer. My mother quickly smiled and said it was probably just a printing mistake. My father nodded without looking at the list, but nobody moved to correct it, and no one could explain why my name was missing. That small moment changed everything. It was no longer just about money or the house. If my name had disappeared from the wedding list by accident, someone could have corrected it immediately. Instead, everyone seemed uncomfortable, as if they already knew something I did not. As I quietly looked around the room, I started remembering other moments from the past year. Important conversations had happened while I was overseas. Family decisions had been made without calling me. Information had reached everyone except me. Suddenly, I realized the house had not been the beginning of the story. Long before it was sold, I had slowly been pushed out of family decisions without even noticing it. That discovery hurt far more than losing money. 2 days after the wedding rehearsal, I received the phone call I had been waiting for. The municipal archives had approved my request to see the old property records connected to my grandfather and our family home. I went there early the next morning, hoping the documents would finally answer the questions that had been growing in my mind. An employee returned carrying several large folders that looked as if they had not been opened for many years. He carefully placed them on the table and told me to take my time because some of the papers were very old. As I slowly turned each page, I realized these were not ordinary documents. There were property valuation reports, ownership amendments, letters between different offices, maps, official correspondence, and handwritten notes made over many years. Every paper added another small piece to the story. None of them directly blamed my parents or accused anyone of doing something illegal. Instead, they quietly recorded dates, signatures, requests, and decisions exactly as they had happened. The more I read, the more confused I became. The timeline in those files did not match the story my parents had told me. According to the records, several important discussions about the property had started long before Kofi became engaged. Some changes had been planned months before anyone mentioned paying for a wedding. That meant the wedding could not have been the only reason behind everything that had happened. I carefully compared the dates with my travel records and the letter from the property consultant. More and more details began to fit together. Someone had been making important decisions while I was working overseas, and those decisions had started much earlier than I had ever imagined. Then I reached the final section of the file. A reference number pointed to one more document that should have been attached, but it was missing. Without that attachment, I still could not see the complete picture. I asked the archive employee about it. He checked the records and quietly explained that the original attachment had never stayed in the archives. Years earlier, it had been transferred to the legal office that prepared the family's official property documents. For the first time, I knew exactly where I needed to go next. The address from the archive led me to a small legal office that had been serving local families for many years. I was told the lawyer who had handled many of my grandfather's documents had already retired, but he still visited the office from time to organize old files. When I arrived, he welcomed me politely after hearing my grandfather's name. He remembered him very well and agreed to speak with me. I expected our conversation to begin with the missing money or the sale of the family home. Instead, he surprised me from the very first minute. He did not ask about my bank accounts. He did not ask how much money had disappeared or whether I wanted to challenge the sale of the house. Instead, he opened an old file, looked at me calmly, and said, "Before we discuss any documents, you need to understand one important difference. Owning something and having permission to make decisions about it are not always the same." His words confused me. Until that moment, I believed the entire problem was about money. But he explained that many families misunderstand the difference between financial ownership and legal authority. Sometimes a person may have rights connected to important family responsibilities, even when other people believe they are free to make decisions. That was why he wanted to talk about authority before discussing anything else. Then he became very serious. Before showing me any confidential records, he asked one simple question. "Did anyone in your family ever explain why your grandfather insisted that certain responsibilities should always remain with one specific person, no matter what happened in the future?" I looked at him without knowing how to answer. I slowly shook my head. No one had ever told me anything like that. My parents had never mentioned such an arrangement. Kofi had never mentioned it either. As far as I knew, my grandfather had simply wanted everyone to live peacefully. The lawyer quietly closed the file for a moment. He nodded as if my answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Then he told me that the conversation we were about to have was no longer about missing savings or a house sale. Those were only the visible parts of the story. The real issue had always been about a responsibility my grandfather carefully protected, but somewhere along the way, the reason behind it had disappeared from the family. After leaving the lawyer's office, I thought carefully about what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront my parents immediately, but another part of me kept thinking about Kofi. Until then, I had believed he might have known much more than he admitted. But after everything I had discovered, I was no longer sure. I decided that before accusing my younger brother, I would give him a chance to see every document for himself. I called him and asked if we could meet somewhere quiet. He agreed without asking many questions. When I placed the folders on the table, Kofi looked surprised by how many papers I had collected. I told him I did not want an argument. I only wanted us to read everything from the beginning and let the documents speak for themselves. For the next several hours, we carefully went through every bank statement, archived property record, letter from the property consultant, handwritten note, travel record, and timeline. Whenever we found a new date, we compared it with another document. Whenever one paper mentioned a meeting, we searched for the letter connected to it. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. As we continued reading, I noticed the expression on Kofi's face changing. At first, he looked confused. Then he became quiet. Finally, he looked deeply shocked. He admitted that our parents had always told him the house was sold only because his wedding expenses had become too heavy. But the records clearly showed that important property decisions had started many months before he even proposed to his fiancée. His wedding had not started the problem. It had simply become the explanation everyone repeated. That realization changed everything between us. Instead of arguing with each other, we began asking the same questions. Why had nobody told either of us the full truth? Why had important meetings been canceled without my knowledge? Why had decisions been made while I was working overseas? And why had our grandfather placed so much importance on authority instead of money? By the end of the evening, neither of us felt angry with the other anymore. We both realized we had been given different parts of the same story. Neither version was complete. We had both trusted what we were told because we trusted our parents. Before leaving, Kofi quietly looked at me and said we could not keep guessing anymore. The documents deserved honest answers. We agreed that the next conversation would not be based on emotions, family pressure, or old excuses. We would sit down with our parents, place every record on the table, and ask them to explain the facts in the order they had actually happened. A few days later, our entire family gathered in the living room. This time, the meeting was not about the wedding or family traditions. It was about the truth. Kofi and I placed every document on the table before anyone started speaking. There were bank records, property files, letters, archived papers, timelines, and copies of every important document we had collected. Instead of making accusations, I simply asked my parents to explain the events in the order they had happened. At first, my parents repeated the same story everyone had already heard. They said everything had been done to help Kofi begin his married life without debt and to protect the family during a difficult time. But as we compared each statement with the documents, their explanations slowly stopped making sense. One date proved another date was impossible. One letter contradicted another explanation. Every time a new record was placed on the table, another part of their story became harder to defend. The relatives who had once praised my parents for their sacrifice now became very quiet. Some of them began asking simple questions that nobody had asked before. If the wedding was the reason, why had property decisions started months earlier? Why had meetings been canceled without my knowledge? Why had important papers been handled while I was working overseas? This time, my parents could not answer with the same confidence. After a long silence, my father lowered his head. He admitted that he had become too worried about how the family would look to other people. He wanted everything to appear successful and peaceful, even if important decisions had to be rushed. He quietly accepted that those choices should never have been made without being honest with me. My mother wiped away tears and finally spoke. She admitted that hiding information had caused far more damage than losing money ever could. She said she had believed keeping everyone uninformed would avoid conflict, but instead it had broken trust inside the family. For the first time since I came home, no one tried to defend the past anymore. The truth was finally sitting on the table for everyone to see. Months passed after that family meeting, and little by little, everything began to move in the right direction. Independent professionals carefully reviewed all the records, property documents, bank statements, and legal files before any final decisions were made. After everyone understood the complete timeline, the financial matters were settled through lawful agreements that every person accepted. There were no more hidden meetings, unanswered questions, or decisions made behind closed doors. For the first time in a long while, everything was based on facts instead of assumptions. Kofi continued with his marriage, but this time he did it knowing the full truth. He made it clear that he never wanted his future to depend on sacrifices that had been taken from someone else without permission. He and his wife started their new life by making their own financial plans instead of carrying the weight of old family mistakes. Watching my brother make that choice reminded me that honesty can still change the direction of a family, even after painful discoveries. My parents also changed in ways I never expected. They stopped trying to justify the past and accepted responsibility for what had happened. My father admitted that fear of family expectations and pride had pushed him to make decisions without including the people who were most affected. My mother apologized for believing that keeping secrets would protect the family when it had actually damaged the trust that held us.